earliest memory of Granny, which would have been 4, so we're talking 1946 or what have you at that juncture in time. Granny was the dominant figure in our familial relations. She and Aunt Martha lived at 317 West 83rd Street. They were in apartment 6E, if memory serves me correctly. And that was a pretty nice neighborhood back in the old days. We lived up on 102nd between Broadway and Amsterdam. 107th, not 102nd, 107th between Broadway and Amsterdam, because she would not let Dad in the house. And she had raised my mother. And the pieces you have to remember is that when Mom was 7, which would have been 1923, Granny sued her own son for custody of Mother. She was persuaded that her son Bascom was an alcoholic, which he was, and not fit to raise Helen. And she hired Delancey Nichols, who was a very prominent attorney in New York, and had been, I think, her husband been the deputy district attorney for the city of New York. He was a reform candidate back in the day, passed away a long time ago. But Delancey Nichols had been one of his partners. She hired Delancey Nichols, famous attorney, and she was, you can read about this on the front pages of the New York Times, 1923. Helen is, my mother is 7 years old, and Granny is losing the case. Out of nowhere, Bascom and his wife lived in Ohio. Her father eventually was the first president of Wooster College, where Julie graduated from almost 100 years later. But at any rate, out of nowhere, there's this milkman who claims to have had relations with Bascom's wife. And long story short, she gains custody of my mother. And so my mother grows up in what amounts to a privileged environment in New York, and then goes to London, meets my father, they get married. Granny is very upset about that. Mom comes home, Dad gets over there. So now I'm 4 or 5 years old, the older boys are 7 or 8 years old. And every weekend we would go down to Granny's for lunch or dinner, depending upon the circumstance. And Dad was not allowed to come, and so we would go down. I'm saying this all now in retrospect. I had no idea what the heck was going on at the time. But we would go down there, and she was incredible. She was very bright. She was very old. I mean, we're talking, my earliest memory is 46, and she's born either in 1850 or 1857. And Laura probably has the answer to that. Let us assume for a moment it's 1857. So she is 89 or 90 when I'm first remembering her. She has in her room a picture of Douglas MacArthur, General MacArthur, on her wall. She thought Douglas MacArthur was the be-all and the end-all. She was a friend of Madame Chiang Kai-shek's and had gifts from General Chiang Kai-shek and Madame Chiang Kai-shek. And she brooked no arguments. You would sit down at the table in her dining room, and she would talk, and you would listen, and she would ask questions, and you would answer questions, and it didn't make any difference whether you were 4 or 5-year-old Jamie or you were 70-year-old Rear Admiral Jack Stapler. I mean, she asked the question, he answered the question. The vignettes I would give you is that most of the family has heard this now, but when I was in 2nd grade, early on, I felt I had been unfairly thrown out of recess, which struck me as one of the earliest signs of my capacity to be righteously indignant. And so I walked out of the school at the age of, I would have been, well, it would have been 6 and a half or 7, something like that. And Granny's place was maybe 5 blocks from the school, and I walked to Granny's place and got in there, and she was sitting, she brought me into the dining room where she had the desk which now sits in our living room, and she was sitting there, and she said to me, "Jamie, tell me exactly what has happened." And I told her that what had happened. I said I didn't think I'd done anything wrong and that I had been unfairly treated. And she picked up the phone and she called the superintendent of public instruction for the city of New York. I couldn't tell you whether she knew him or not, but he apparently recognized her name because he took her call. And she relayed what had happened and indicated that she expected that there would be some sort of appropriate action. And that in the meantime, she was sending me back to the school and did not want any adverse repercussions until he had had a chance to examine the circumstances. She hung up the phone and she said, "All right, Jimmy," she said, "now you will go back to school." And I said, "I don't want to go back to school." She says, "It's not a question of what you want, it is a question of what's appropriate. And so you will go back to the school." So I went back to the school, as you might guess. So I remember that. And there were a number of instances like that. She took me up to Broadway one time when she could still walk. We walked up to Broadway, and I would have been, again, 7 or 8, maybe 6. And we were standing on Broadway and 83rd. And there was a black family. And she pointed them out to me and she said, "Jimmy, those are Negroes." She said, "Other people will call them a lot of things, but that is what they wish to be called today, and so you should be aware that they are Negroes, and they have value, and you should pay attention." And then she was on to something else right away. But I mean, she would leap in and give you these directives and these pieces of wisdom. She loved Gabriel Heater in the news, but she also loved the Lone Ranger, and she loved Sergeant Preston Yukon. She was an amazing person, and again, you have to put this in some context. If she was born in 1850, she was 10 years old when the Civil War broke out. If she was born in 1857, she was 4 or 5 when the war broke out, but she would have been 10 or 11 by the time the war was over. She remembered the Civil War. Amazing, amazing woman. Bright, tough, humorless, I would say, but interesting.